On the 25th of October, Israel launched a targeted raid into Iran as their promised response for what happened on the 1st of October when Iran attacked Israel on itself, also for responding to what Israel had previously done. And you just see we continue ratcheting up the escalation ladder. Now, a lot of people are thinking, well, maybe we dodged a bullet with that because it didn't turn out. They didn't go after the nuclear sites. They didn't go after the oil infrastructure, et cetera. And we thought, okay, maybe things are going to tamp down. The initial comments from the Iranian people seem to imply that, okay, that wasn't great, but it wasn't that big of a deal either. So maybe we can just, everything can be copacetic. And great sigh of relief in Washington that, okay, we avoided the big war. But maybe it was just we avoided the big war for the moment, because now then we have Iran coming out again, now ramping their rhetoric back up, saying that there is a definitive, painful response to Israel, likely possibly even before the election on 5 November. To try to unpack this and make some sense out of it and kind of interpret what various sides are saying, we have Ambassador Chaz Freeman, one of our favorites and one of the most knowledgeable people on the Middle East. Ambassador, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you, Danny.
Well, look, let's just jump right in here. It's interesting in that, and you and I were chatting a little bit before we came on the air here, and you said that you didn't really think, even from the beginning, that this was just dodged a bullet, but you said based on what you saw about what was attacked, that might presage something later.
Yeah, I think we have two dangers now. One, the pattern of the Israeli attack, which aimed both at missile production facilities, meaning solid fuel mixing plant, and radar associated with the S-300 air defense system that the Iranians got from the Russians. This looks very clearly, on the one hand, of course, trying to incapacitate Iran's ability to manufacture additional missiles, but also trying to erode Iran's air defenses in anticipation of another Israeli attack on Iran, preparation for it. So we have two dangers now. One is Iran having reacted in a very measured manner to the Israeli attack, claiming that, in fact, the damage to the missile production facility was minimal and that their air defenses remain intact, now threatens to retaliate against Israel for that attack. And there's every reason to believe that if they do, it will not be in the restrained manner of the previous two exchanges. But we also have the danger that Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, who would like nothing better than to have the excuse of yet another round of attacks from Iran in order to launch his own further attacks on Iran, that he may not wait. He may, having, in his view, prepared the way for another Israeli attack on Iran, he may just do it. So in either event, we have the situation of tit for tat, the spiraling escalation that has been going on. We have the prospect of its continuing to an even more ferocious level, and doing so in the fairly near future.
Now, the some of the speculation at the time of the 25 October attack was that it had come after a lot of heavy American diplomacy. The Secretary of State had been there. The Secretary of Defense had met his counterpart in Yoav Gallant. And the idea was, okay, well, apparently America talked him off the ledge, or at least said, hey, don't do anything before 5 November because we don't want anything to happen on the election. Do you put in much credibility into that so-called?
Yeah, I think that is actually very likely what happened. And I would note that in addition to counseling for restraint, undoubtedly Israel got a payoff, not just in terms of the two THAAD installations that have been moved. There are only 9 in the world, two THAAD installations that have been moved to Israel, thus providing both additional protection against Iranian missiles and an American tripwire on the ground, which would probably guarantee American involvement in the war with Iran, which is what Netanyahu has wanted all along. Getting the United States involved is key to achieving Israeli escalation dominance and hegemony in the region. So I think undoubtedly there were both incentives and strong counseling and pleas not to do something before the election. Israel has a very bad record of heeding any advice from the United States or considering American interests when it acts. So I don't know where this leaves us.
Now, there has been some speculation among some quarters here in Washington, some of the folks I've spoken to, that said actually Israel may have incentive not to listen to what the current administration says, because apparently some of them would prefer Trump anyway. And somehow they speculate that Netanyahu may calculate that that's doing something, as you put in, a preemptive sort of way prior to the election, could help tilt the thing in the direction of Trump. But I'm not sure I buy off on that and wonder if your view on it, because I mean, whether you're talking about Harris or Trump, they seem to be falling all over themselves talking about who's the bigger supporter of Israel. How do you see that?
Well, on this issue, they're Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They're both belligerent. They both encourage Israel to do things that jeopardize American interests, in my view. I don't see the political logic, particularly, for why an Israeli attack would help Trump. But maybe I'm just blind on that. The Israelis have a record of reading our politics very accurately. So maybe that is a consideration. What is not in doubt is that Mr. Netanyahu who is probably the most, no, I don't say probably, certainly the most egregious foreign manipulator of American politics in existence, strongly favors Trump because he thinks he can manipulate Trump with ease, as indeed he did during Trump's first term with the so-called Abraham Accords, which sought to set aside the Palestinian issue in favor of an economic approach favoring Israel and its relations with wealthy Arab states in the region, and also moving the embassy to Jerusalem and unilaterally recognizing the Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights, which are part of Syria under occupation by Israel. So there's a record here of Mr. Netanyahu being able to run rings around Mr. Trump. And why wouldn't he want him back in power?
Well, I guess when it comes to running rings, I don't know that it makes any difference whether it's Trump, Harris, or President Biden, as Doug talks about here in a recent interview on our show.
The last play and the most important play that Mr. Netanyahu has is to bring us into the war on Israel's behalf against Iran. If you sit down privately with anybody in the White House right now, I think they will confide in you and say, we really don't want a war with Iran. I know that in the Department of Defense, the attitude at the highest levels is we really don't want a war with Iran. They understand what that means, the consequences for our own economy, for the financial system, and also for the region, and the potential for bringing Russia into the equation. Or the Russians have thousands of people on the ground in Iran right now. They've built up the air and missile defense apparatus as rapidly and effectively as they can, but they've also flooded lots of other technologies into the country, particularly missiles and weapons. So Iran is ready in a way that it has probably never been to deal with this Israeli attack.
And Doug, let me ask you,
will not exercise any restraint after Israel attacks them.
I agree completely with Doug McGregor on this. That is the Netanyahu intention. And I would note there's a great deal of spurious triumphalism in Israel at the moment. Of course, both sides, Iran and Israel, tend to disparage, underestimate the damage that has been done to either of them by the other. That's for propaganda purposes, for domestic political morale purposes. The problem is in Israel, they do seem to believe that they have done a great deal more damage to Iran than is apparent. And they may therefore think this is a moment of weakness in which they can attack Iran with impunity. That is, not receiving a counterblow of significance. They have a history of making mistakes based on triumphalism. They're having a hard time in the land war in southern Lebanon, and much harder than they estimated. They seem to believe that if you assassinate a leader, that the organization that leader leads will then fall apart. But there's very little, if any, evidence of that ever happening. And the usual pattern is if you assassinate a leader, you get a more ferocious and hateful person in his or her place. So Hezbollah is not defeated. Hamas is not defeated. Iran has not been defeated. And Israel is taking grave risks with its own future and with ours.
And I want to go in a little bit to what Israel is trying to accomplish here, because they've actually not been very shy about saying what their objectives are. First of all, I want to start it with something the former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said. Actually, he's been saying it on quite a number of American shows, really going to bat real. And almost, he's the official spokesman, you could almost say, for the Israeli government. Here's one from early in the month where he was talking about a 50-year opportunity. But he's going to say something in here. I want you to note where I think that he's got a big hole in his logic.
Do you believe that this is a unique opportunity for Israel to actually go and topple the Iranian regime?
Yes, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity, because Iran's strategy, as I called it, the octopus of terror, the head of the octopus is in Tehran, and it sends its arms all across the Middle East. But two of its most important arms, Hamas and Hezbollah, are dramatically weakened and right now cannot mount an effective retaliation. So in effect, Iran is laid bare and is vulnerable. And if we don't take care of Iran, if we leave Iran as it is, they'll rebuild their tentacles. They're going to fund a new Hezbollah, fund a new Hamas. Only if we neutralize their nuclear program and hit the head of the octopus, ultimately, not tomorrow, but ultimately within a few years, toppling the Iranian regime, that'll bring a whole new future to the Middle East. Essentially, do is give a gift to the wonderful people of Iran by hitting its regime, hitting the nuclear facilities, and allowing its people to press for a regime change.
To me, to signal that within a few years we're going to wipe out your regime guarantees 100% continued resistance by the other side. So I'm not sure what they even thinking of when he says that. How did you read it?
Well, I think it's a fundamentally erroneous strategic analysis. In fact, all of the signs are that the divisions in Iran that have troubled the regime have been largely eliminated by an upsurge of nationalist fervor. In fact, I think the Ayatollah Khamenei, when he initially said, let's not exaggerate or let's not underestimate the evil that Israel has done, was a very restrained statement. He said, I will leave it to the experts in my government to figure out what to do. What happened was an upsurge of pressure on the regime to act against Israel, not to withhold a counterblow. And I think it is a mistake to imagine that a 2,500-year-old culture, a country, a state that's been around in one form or another for that long, is somehow going to get toppled by an external threat. Quite the contrary is likely to happen. Finally, I would note that the statement that Hezbollah does not have the capacity to mount a retaliation is belied by the fact that it is mounting a retaliation into farther and farther into Israel, away from the border. And it may have its command and control system disrupted by the terrorist act of blowing up walkie-talkies and pagers and having its leadership murdered. But there's every indication that its structure is a decentralized one. The local commanders in southern Lebanon and elsewhere are able to carry on the fight effectively and are doing so. And I'd say finally that the Israelis claim they destroyed half of Hezbollah's missile force in their attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon. I don't think there's any reason to believe that at all. So I think the hubris that Mr. Bennett displays is misplaced.
Well, and in fact, I want to go to that very soundbite you're talking about from the Ayatollah, because he says a number of things in there that I think are very noteworthy.
2 nights ago, they carried out a malicious act. They, of course, exaggerated, which is wrong. But at the same time, it shouldn't be downplayed, either by saying it was insignificant or unimportant. The Zionist regime miscalculations must be stopped. They are making serious mistakes in judgment. They do not understand the Iranian people. They have not recognized the strength, capability, creativity, and determination of the Iranian nation. They must be made to understand these realities, and it's up to the country's authorities to determine the appropriate response that best serves the interest of the nation and the country.
But his instruction there, I mean, literally, it's everything you just mentioned. But he also added in that Israel must be made to understand. And apparently that was the directive there. And as it's already happening, again, you referred to it in Lebanon, Israel is suffering significant casualties. Gary just had one headline up there from apparently a couple of hours ago, but then some recently have said that there have been significant casualties among the IDF, among their armored forces, among their infantry troops, and the going is very, very slow and difficult. As anyone who had studied anything about the 2006 Lebanon War would have recognized, that was biting off a whole lot more than they can chew. But I guess maybe to underscore your comment about the belief by the Israeli side that using lots of bombs and having big splashy explosions can accomplish strategic objectives, I think maybe end up being their Achilles heel.
What Israel's objectives are within Palestine are to cement Jewish supremacy by expelling or exterminating the Palestinian population, carrying out what they call Nakba II, the second catastrophe for the Palestinians. What its objectives in Lebanon are to annex basically a free fire zone and gain access to the Litani River and its water for Israeli benefit. It has displaced 1 million people. That does not endear it to Lebanese or any others among its neighbors. And finally, and I think what this goes to what the Ayatollah was saying, this is a contest for escalation, dominance, and hegemony in the entire region. When Mr. Bennett talks about knocking out Iran, what he's basically saying is that Israel is not comfortable in a region where it has not subjugated and subordinated all of its neighbors. The last remaining one that is effective against it is Iran. But the Iranians are responding that no, they will not accept Israeli dominance. They will not be subjugated. They will continue to contest the balance of power in the region, and they will continue to reserve the right to defend themselves. And in their case, that is exactly what they are doing. Israel is not defending itself. It is conducting a war of expansion, annexation, and extermination of another people.
And if anybody has any doubts, I mean, I guess it's one thing to say, here's what a former prime minister is saying, because you can always have a degree of separation and there can be equivocation of the guys in charge now. But then when you listen to the current prime minister, he erases any doubts anybody could have of what his intentions really are.
We are here in the state of Israel. We are the real barrier in Iran's path, and we thwart its malicious intentions. Because according to Iran's method, if Israel will fall, many countries will fall along with it, and the entire Middle East will fall into its hands. But we do not fall. We will win. And the entire world will be a better place, a safer place. Our victory will not be just for us. It will be for all of humanity. At the beginning of the war, I defined the main objectives of the campaign, and we are working consistently to achieve them. The elimination of the governing and military capabilities of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the return of all our precious hostages back home. And we also stipulated thwarting any future threat from Gaza to Israel and returning the residents of the South and the North safely to their homes. This is the meaning of absolute victory, not as a mere headline uttered into space, nor rhetoric void of substance, rather the opposite. The absolute victory is an orderly and consistent work plan, which we fulfill step by step.
And in that same speech, he also said one thing very, very clear on Iran. Gary, if you can toss that headline up there, where he wrote that after each of our achievements, I hear the former officials on television studios say, well, we understand the immediate war goals, but what's the strategy? Pretty good question, actually. So if it's not clear by now, I will lay it out in simple terms. Our long-term strategy, which I hope will be achieved shortly, is to dismantle the evil axis, sever its tentacles in the north and south, extract a heavy toll from Iran and proxies, and prevent it from obtaining nuclear arms. So he again is basically saying everything that Naftali Bennett said and then adding some things onto it. So one of the other things I specifically want your comment on that he said in that was that basically he's saying, look, fellas, look, I know y'all don't like how many people are dying, but my God, we're doing this for you guys, because if we don't do this, Iran will dominate the Middle East. What do you say?
This, of course, inverts cause and effect. Israel, by doing so many hateful things, generates hate. That generates enemies. I think, in many ways, the Abraham Accords are flawed because they attempted to ignore the underlying causes of the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians and other Arabs and Iran, for that matter. But they do show something, and that is that, people are prepared to make peace with Israel. They started out, the region started out rejecting the two-state solution. Now they all insist on it. And it is Israel which refuses to accept it. The Knesset has passed legislation which makes it clear that there will never be Israeli agreement to a two-state solution. There is no prospect of Arabs within Israel under Israeli occupation getting the franchise and being admitted to a democracy. So this is the case of, basically Israel's in the position of a burglar who comes into someone's home and says, my great-great-great-great-grandfather owned this house and I have a right to it. And when he's resisted, they say, I have a right to defend myself. Well, you're a burglar. You're a murderer. You're an assassin. You're a terrorist. Israel is a terrorist state. It was born in terror. It rules by terror. What Netanyahu is explaining is more terror. How can this possibly produce anything but prolonged warfare?
That is the operative question, and I think the answer is unfortunately self-evident. In the amount of time we have left, I want to slightly shift direction back onto the human level on the receipt side of some of these Israeli actions. He mentioned Netanyahu did in that last clip there about how they're going to make sure that the danger and the risk that they face from Hamas in the Gaza Strip never materializes again, and he's going to keep that down. But then earlier this week at the United Nations Security Council, the representative of the Palestinian people made this impassioned plea.
Palestinians are at risk of imminent death, faced with the death penalty for refusing to leave their land. I sat in the Security Council week after week, stood before the General Assembly week after week, hoping to be able to tell my people that help is on the way. They endured horrors that you watch on your TV screens and yet can barely comprehend but their tormentors continue to be shielded and Palestinian victims continue to be abandoned.
Pretty hard to argue with that. And when you're comparing what Netanyahu said in his speech and what the Palestinian representative said there, which side would you say represents ground truth reality the most?
Well, I think it's important at this point to note that Israel has basically declared war on the United Nations. It has killed a huge number of UN staff in Gaza. It has now tried to make UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Work Agency, which it initially insisted be created to handle the refugee problem, the Palestinian refugee problem it created in 1948, it is trying to abolish it and to deny it any role in feeding, clothing, and housing the Palestinians. All this while it's conducting an extermination campaign, which the Palestinian ambassador explained. So there's a real question, and I hear now people asking, how can Israel still remain a member of the United Nations? When South Africa, which was also practicing apartheid, a much milder version of it, I should say, did so, in 1974, it was expelled from the UN. Why is Israel not expelled? Question is, would that do any good? Well, it would certainly bring home to Israelis the extent to which they have turned the entire world against them. Look at the attack on Iran. There were only two governments that condoned that, our own and the British. Everyone else either condemned it or expressed disapproval in some form. Look at the votes in the United Nations and the trend there. The United States and Israel are now almost completely isolated. Israel is not going to recover from this if it makes a further attack on Iran. If it suffers a counterattack from Iran, much of the world will applaud, not deplore what happens. This is something that Mr. Netanyahu has had a lot to do with creating as a situation. And I think he will answer. Of course, you know, a diplomat is supposed to be able to explain to you why going to hell is in your interest and make you want to go there. We've not yet succeeded with Mr. Netanyahu, but he's definitely headed in that direction after this life.
Yeah, it's again hard to argue with any of that, and those trends are unmistakable. I guess part of the problem is that you talked a minute ago about arrogance, and that certainly is a saturating practice in Israel, but also in the United States, because I think that many of the powers that be, and it doesn't make any difference which party we're talking about, seem to think that it doesn't matter, that it's okay if it's us and the rest of the world, which just is very puzzling to me, at least according to the America that I used to know, the one that I willingly went to fight for and served as in my military capacity for a career. But now that it's like we don't seem to care about those kinds of things, like what's going on in the Gaza Strip, like what's happening in Beirut to the civilian population throughout Lebanon. And I just find that disappointing. Perhaps puzzling is not the right word. But where do you see this going if these trends maintain in terms of the United States and Israel being isolated?
Well, our influence abroad is demonstrably far, far less than it ever was. We don't show up at meetings. We're not invited to meetings. We just saw the formation, the expansion of the BRICS grouping at Kazan in Russia. This is not an alliance. It's not NATO. It's not even a club or a grouping of like-minded countries. It's a forum. It is a replacement and workaround for the United Nations, which is no longer serving the purpose of the peoples around the world's will. It is ineffectual. And the issue that has made it most dramatically clear that the UN is ineffectual is Israeli defiance of it Israeli actions, which are totally illegal under international law, and Israeli indifference to human suffering. So we are entirely complicit in this. We fund Israeli expansionism. We supply the weapons that are murdering people. We support it. We even support, apparently, its attack on Iran. How else to explain the deployment of American troops and THAAD installations in Israel? So I think we're both Israel come out of this as unacceptable company pretty much anywhere in the world. We're going to come out of it with greatly diminished influence and ability to defend our own interests because we've been so assiduous in defending the policies of Israel, which I think are contrary to Israeli interests, but which Mr. Netanyahu believes are essential to them.
In the last bit of time we have here, I'd like to get your thoughts on something that happened actually quite a long time ago. About 2 weeks or so ago, we had on our show, we showed a clip of former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo showing absolute revulsion at the idea that some people make that Israel is an apartheid state. It's just insulting, and he can't believe that anyone would even say such a crazy thing like that. And obviously, he represented a lot of the elite class in Washington, D.C., again, across any parties. Well, that's interesting view for an American official to make, because another former American official back in 2006 wrote a book. Gary, if you can toss that book up there, because it was very interesting. He was Jimmy Carter published a book that was called, I think it was Peace, Not Apartheid. And he was wanting to get people in the Middle East to come together. And he was interviewed on his book and asked some specific questions about Charlie Rose. And watch this exchange.
You're in favor of a two-state solution.
Absolutely.
Why do you say peace, not apartheid?
Well, I don't say just that. You left out the first word.
Palestine.
Well, Palestine distinguishes the word apartheid from Israel. I don't allege in any way that within the nation of Israel there's any element of apartheid. In the occupied territories, there is a profoundly disturbing proof of apartheid in its worst form. And I would say it's much more damaging in some ways to the Palestinians under the subjection of domination of Israel, even than the black people suffered in South Africa. So I use the word advisedly of apartheid in Palestine. I also use two other words in there. Peace is what I prefer, not apartheid. And I believe that it's entirely possible for Israel to have peace, for the Palestinians to have peace, if Israel ever adopts the policy of a majority of Israelis, and that is to swap occupied territory, which belongs to the Palestinians, in favor of having peace for themselves.
Can you even imagine if that had been put into effect at that time in the early 2000s, that we said, all right, we're going to have this, we're going to call it what it is. And he was unequivocal and unapologetic about saying that what the Israeli people were doing in the occupied territories was an apartheid state. And he said, but listen, here's the path forward. He, instead of just, condemning or whatever, he said, here's a path forward. Imagine what the world could look like today if we'd have had the political courage to do something about it back then.
Well, he was a man of great political courage, is a man of great political courage. At Camp David, he basically single-handedly forced Israel to accept a peace with Egypt. And unfortunately, that peace was incomplete because while it contained a pledge to deal with the issue of Palestinian self-determination, it did not provide a mechanism for that to happen. And his successors apparently had no interest in justice for the Palestinians. So the situation has steadily worsened. I listened very carefully to what he said, and his language is very precise. He's absolutely correct. Within Israel proper, what is prevalent is a form of segregation, which would be very familiar to people who grew up in the South years ago. What is in force in the occupied territories and in Gaza is an entirely different matter. And it is, as he indicated, far worse than the milder form of apartheid that prevailed in South Africa. Israel basically consists of four components. One is Israeli Jewish citizens who have full rights in a democracy. Second is segregated Arab Israelis within Israel proper who do not enjoy access to resources on a fair basis and who are dismissed politically and socially, isolated. Third, Palestinians in the West Bank who are subject to constant settler violence and exclusion from their own land, separate road system, which we never developed in our country under segregation, and the South Africans did not really in their country. And finally, Gaza, where you're either barely alive or about to be dead, basically being shot at, bombed, strafed, starved. And now we have something called the General's Plan, which is Giora Island's plan to depopulate Gaza of Palestinians, either by killing them or starving them, and replace them with Israeli settlers. So this is a far worse situation than ever existed in South Africa, and yet the collective West backs it to its discredit. In a context in which the rise of the rest, as Fareed Zakaria called it, is a reality, and the center of the economic center of gravity and the political center of gravity in the world no longer are in the Euro-Pacific, the Euro-Atlantic region, but have moved to the Pacific and to Africa and the South. So I think Mr. Carter showed in that conversation his attention to detail, his comprehension, his compassion, and his desire for justice. And I don't see that in our current leadership in either party.
Speaking of the way the rest of the world is viewing things, what do you think would have to happen for all these folks that are in the rest of the world to actually say, okay, I get it, you're the United States of America, but even us, we're finally going to stand up against you, and we're not going to remain silent anymore. And we're not going to be passive either in the face of all of these things you just described so eloquently, horribly in the Gaza Strip. What would it take for them to get over that? Because basically for 75 years, it's never even been contemplated. But now, is it being contemplated, or is it going to continue on the way it is right now?
Well, I think the progress of the BRICS grouping is a symptom of the very important evolution that's going on. The BRICS movement began as a sort of protest against the group of seven, the G7, the club of former imperialist powers, wishing to continue to make the rules and apply them selectively to different countries around the world. You know, it's very interesting that the International Court of Justice, the criminal court, have applied laws to African leaders that they've declined to apply to anyone else. And we see now that instead of backing the institutions of international law that I mentioned, the West is trying to cripple them in terms of their application to Israel. So I think we have a situation in which we are generating increasing opposition to ourselves. We are becoming isolated, and we're not competing effectively internationally as we claim we are. I see the thing that Gary has just put up there, and I think one of the interesting aspects of this is the basic revolt of the Israeli military and intelligence services, who say, look, we're going down a path that leads to disaster. Basically they're calling for the Aiken formula, if you remember that in Vietnam. Let's declare victory when we have it, and not continue down the road to defeat, because Israel has not been defeated yet, but it is suffering. All of the things that Mr. Netanyahu described as fundamental objectives, the release of the hostages hasn't happened. The destruction of Hamas has not happened. He could have added the destruction of Hezbollah. Has not happened. The cowing of Iran has not happened. And more of the same is not going to succeed. It is simply going to widen the war and enlist still others. You know, Hamas is now on a recruitment roll throughout, not just in Palestine, but throughout the Palestinian diaspora, which is millions and millions of people, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere. Can you imagine the large group of Lebanese Americans and what they think about what Israel is doing to their countrymen? Whether they are most of them are Christian, I believe, but
yeah.
The fact is that they're Lebanese also. And Israel is murdering large numbers of people in Lebanon.
Yeah, I've often, I don't want to get on a tangent, but I've often wondered why so many Christian Americans seem to be oblivious to the Christian Lebanese and the Christian Palestinians that are also being killed in equally large numbers, why we never seem to care about our alleged brothers. But I digress. Last question I want to ask you here is, in light of literally everything we've talked about here and all the dangers and where all the fault lines are, what will happen if Iran makes good on its threat and actually does a big strike against Israel that this time has casualties? What happens next?
Well, I don't know. I think Iran has the capability to do that, and the pattern of escalation suggests that they will. I don't think they want to continue. They've been trying to avoid a war. Israel has been insisting on one. I think Israel's going to get what it wants in terms of a war, but not in terms of the battle damage that it will be done to it. I want to make a point here. By contrast with Israel, which has cared nothing about so-called collateral damage, that is prepared to kill hundreds of people in order to murder one leader of an opposition or resistance group. Both Iran and Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, have limited their strikes to military targets up to now. I think they are both leaving that behind. And Israel will be very sorry when they begin to follow its pernicious example and go after civilians as well as military targets. So, is Israel a viable state in this circumstance? It has made an enemy of everybody in its neighborhood and now the wider world. Can the world tolerate this? Will Israel continue to exist on this path? I think the intelligence and military people in Israel are correctly concerned about this. And Mr. Netanyahu should listen to them, but he won't.
Doesn't sound like it. Well, I guess like everybody else, we're going to have to wait and see what happens. Some speculated something could come from Iran prior to the election, so we could literally be days away. Or who knows, maybe they try to find some diplomatic way out to where they can avoid going up that next escalation ladder. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see how it works out. But thank you very much for coming on today, providing really such clarity and a lot of the background, a lot of this stuff that we see in the meaning behind it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And we always appreciate you guys as well, and want to let you know, by the way, we were going to have Alex of History Legends on next. We were going to have a triple header today, but due to some scheduling conflicts, we had to move that to tomorrow. So that will be tomorrow at 2 p.m. But today at 3 p.m., we have Alexander Mercurius of the Duran, and we're going to be looking at the Russia-Ukraine war. Are we entering the end game? I promise you, you don't want to miss that show. Join us at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and we'll see you next on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.